Hello there my RPG lovers and welcome to another video. The core gameplay loop is something that's always been done exceptionally well in all Mount & Blade games, and Bannerlord is no different. This was actually my main concern before Bannerlord released, because the way that combat feels in a Mount & Blade game is extremely important. Since Bannerlord runs on a new engine, creating a similar combat experience and actually improving it was probably not an easy task. Not just the combat system of course, every other feature in the game as well. This was probably the main reason why we had to wait so long for this game. Even though Taleworlds entertainment is much bigger than it used to be, it's still not huge by any means. And let's not forget that the first Mount & Blade game was developed by only 2 people, so this studio definitely came a long way. Bannerlord came out in early access on Steam, which means the game still lacks some features like additional voiceovers, more quests, unique maps for towns, castles and villages, and so on. But the game in its current state has all the major features, and you probably won't even notice that something is missing. That being said, let's go back to the beginning and talk about everything that this game has to offer. If you never played any of Mount & Blade games, this might be a strange experience. Depends on what you expect to find in this game. Bannerlord is a medieval strategy sandbox action RPG, and just saying those words in the same sentence is weird, but this series of games is very unique for that same reason. While that might sound intimidating, you won't have a lot of trouble to understand how Bannerlord works. When you start the game, you get to create and customize your character. You can choose between 6 different cultures that will give you different gameplay advantages, but this is nothing major. Character customization is quite extensive for a single player game. You have more than enough options to create a unique character. And then you wear a helmet through the entire game. Choosing your background is the most interesting feature in the character creation menu in my opinion. The decisions you make here will affect your starting attributes, and you get to see your own character growing up, which is a really nice touch. This is actually nothing new because previous Mount & Blade games had the same feature, but Bannerlord has a much better presentation. This same feature in Warband was just covered in walls of text, so it was not very immersive. When you're done with creating your character, there is a nice review menu where you can see all the choices you made. And once you select a couple of different difficulty options, you're good to go. I suggest leaving the difficulty on default settings if this is your first time playing a Mount & Blade game. But since your boy is a veteran of this franchise, selecting anything but the hardest difficulty is just not an option. The tutorial of the game should give you a good idea of how combat works, and the most important thing you should learn here is that Bannerlord is not a hack and slash game. We'll talk about the combat a bit later. When you finish the tutorial, you can basically do whatever you want. There is a main quest that you can follow, and it basically acts like the extension of the tutorial where you can learn how other features in the game work. I feel like a lot of people might get lost after they finish the tutorial. To avoid this from happening, you should keep in mind that this is a sandbox game, which basically means that you can set your own goals. But in order to do that, you really need to understand how the world in Bannerlord works. You have a huge world map where everything is happening in real time. This is one of the biggest real-time strategy features in the game, and even if you never played older Mount & Blade games, it shouldn't be hard to understand. Actually, Bannerlord has a much friendlier user interface than its prequels. There's a lot of quality of life updates, which makes it really hard to play older Mount & Blade games after Bannerlord. Just the ability to select a particular place that will always be visible on the map will make your life much easier. Since the overall design of the UI is quite good, navigating through those menus is not a tedious process. Especially because of the great color palette, which makes everything look clean. It makes it really easy to notice all the interactable things in the menus, which is actually quite important. But if you ever feel lost, you have the encyclopedia menu, which will have all the information that you need. Even though you're able to go wherever you want right from the start, that's probably not a great idea. You won't have any negative reputation with factions, so they won't bother you, but there are a bunch of bandits everywhere. But if the number of your troops is bigger, bandits will just run away from you. This is really useful to know, especially in the beginning of the game. No matter what you plan to do in the game, you should definitely try to recruit as many people as you can as soon as possible. Recruiting soldiers can be done in all villages and cities, but of course you need to have enough gold. That sounds easy because it is, but taking care of your soldiers is the hard part. You need to make sure that you always have at least some kind of food in your inventory, otherwise the morale of your troops will drop. And if that happens, your soldiers have a high chance to flee from the battle. You really can't blame them for that, but hey, you can still kill them. Those who survive will gain experience, and this is how you can upgrade your troops. Keep in mind that higher ranked troops will have bigger wages. Every faction has strengths and weaknesses when it comes to their troops, but this is quite easy to learn after a few battles. Not long after the game begins, you get introduced to clans, which is a major feature in Bannerlord. This is not exclusive to your character because every faction in the game have their own clans. These clans can even be hostile towards their own faction, which I found really interesting. There are 5 clan levels in total, and you can raise the level of your clan by gaining more renew. And you can do that in a few ways, like fighting large groups of enemies, becoming a mercenary or vassal, and winning tournaments in big cities. In order to work for any faction, your clan needs to be at least level 2. Higher clan levels will extend your party limit and allow you to create your own faction. Managing your kingdom is basically a game within a game, but I won't go in depth with this system. Getting to this point probably sounds really hard, especially if you just started playing and you lost a fight to a couple of looters. And this is a nice excuse to talk about the combat. The fundamentals of this action combat system are really simple, but the combat is hard to master. No matter how good you become in fighting a couple of enemies at once, you will fail in bigger fights if you don't approach them strategically, especially on hard difficulties. You can get away in smaller battles with just outnumbering your enemy, but you'll absolutely need to have a battle plan in more serious fights. The best way to learn the basics of this combat system is to find the nearest arena and do practice fights. You should visit different cities from different factions because not all arenas are the same. Not just because of the different looks, you'll get to fight with different weapons as well. This should help you to understand the fundamentals of this combat system. You have 4 directional attacks that you control entirely with your mouse. You can use the movement keys instead, but I don't recommend playing like this. If you didn't play older Mountain Blade games, you'll definitely need some time to get used to how combat works, especially when it comes to blocking. Unlike its prequels, Bannerlord doesn't have the option to automatically block incoming hits. This means that you'll have to manually block in every direction unless you have a shield. Blocking with shields is more forgiving, but it's still advisable to block in the right direction because you can get hit from different angles. I talked about this in my combat guide that you can check out by clicking on the card in the right corner. Speaking about arenas, don't forget to join the tournaments as well. They can be really hard in the beginning when your attributes are low, but after a couple of levels you should be able to win. There is always a solid reward for winning, and you can even bet on yourself if you're feeling confident. However, large battles on the open battlefield will require a different approach. Everything you learned from fighting a couple of enemies at once will definitely come in handy here, but this alone won't be enough to succeed. You can come up with a lot of different tactics and see what works the best for you. Changing the formation of your troops in the middle of the battle is possible, but it's kinda clunky. That's why you should think before the battle begins and organize your troops accordingly. I like to place my weakest troops forward so they can absorb the initial enemy attacks, and then I flank them with my highest level troops while I place all my archers in the back on some hill if terrain allows it. This is actually a similar strategy that Romans used to do. The game will automatically place your troops in the corresponding groups, but you can also arrange them manually from the menu. I always like to have at least one group of strong soldiers that I command to follow me all the time. Fighting in siege battles is one of the most exciting things to do in the game. It's much improved compared to Warband, but I think it still needs some work, especially when it comes to AI behavior. But every other feature in siege battles seems to be on point. Pushing a siege ram while evading arrows is such a badass thing to do, among other things. But the performance in these battles can be a problem, especially if you don't have a strong CPU. The game is still not properly optimized in general, and I guess the full version of the game will perform much better. Some recent patches fixed a couple of performance issues though. Even though the graphics are much improved compared to Warband or with Fire and Sword, they are still quite outdated in general. I personally don't have a problem with this because Mountain Blade games were never about graphics. And even if Bannerlord had much better graphics, I couldn't even imagine what kind of PC you would need to run it. Considering that this game is basically a hybrid of genres, the visuals are good enough. The most important thing when it comes to this, at least in my opinion, is the design of weapons and armors, which is quite satisfying. As you would expect from a game with RPG elements, you have a lot of different armors and weapons. Better quality gear is actually quite expensive. Earning gold in the game might seem really hard in the beginning, but when you start working for a faction and invest some gold in caravans, it gets much easier. There is a proper economy system in the game, which means that goods have different prices in different locations. In order to get your own caravans, you will need a decent sum of gold and at least one companion with high enough trade skill. You can find companions all over the world and ask them to join your clan. Your companions will have different attributes and traits, and you can customize them same as your own character. You have more options to interact with NPCs compared to Warband, but it's still a bit underwhelming. After a few encounters with different NPCs, you will notice all the patterns for interaction. It's not that bad, but it quickly becomes predictable and repetitive. Speaking about predictable and repetitive features, the current state with quests in the game can be described like this. We know that Taleworlds plans to implement more quests, but in its current state, this feature leaves a lot to be desired. But one positive thing when it comes to quests are actual consequences that will affect your reputation with important people. You can expect to find skill checks when talking to some important faction NPCs. When it comes to this RPG feature, you'll have some interesting options, like convincing your enemy to surrender, convince them to betray their faction, make a deal by offering some goods, and so on. You can even execute every lord you have as a prisoner, which was actually my preferred playstyle. To counter this, NPCs will have kids that can grow up and eventually act like adults. Your character can also have kids and be married, but just so you know, kids don't grow up that fast in Bannerlord. Well, if they actually get to grow up. You can expect that world map will drastically change after a dozen of hours of playtime. On my first playthrough, I sided with Sturgian faction and we almost completely destroyed Northern Empire in a war. Other factions in the game will also expand or shrink, depends on their war campaigns. This is nothing unusual. If you played a couple of RTS games, you will know what to expect. One really important currency that I didn't mention is influence. You can spend your influence for various things, like deciding who will get the newest acquired property, upgrading your property, supporting or expelling a clan from your kingdom, etc. You will gain influence in war campaigns with your faction, and the amount of influence you get will mostly depend on how much troops you provided for the fight. The amount of influence you have will dictate how much money you receive from the leader of your faction, and if your influence is very low, you can get kicked out from a faction. You can also earn influence by donating troops to allied faction settlements or donating prisoners. Okay, I think I covered all the major RTS features. To be completely honest, I don't think I know enough about real-time strategies, so I can't really judge these features properly. They seem to work as intended, and it's a huge leap compared to Warband, that's for sure. You have a lot of things to play around with, and I think the game does a good job to not overwhelm you with these features in the beginning. When it comes to character progression, you will level up by gaining enough skill points. All of your attributes have a separate experience bar that will increase upon use. This will allow you to unlock different perks for that particular attribute. When you level up, you will gain perk points and focus points. If you want to increase your skill with a particular attribute faster, you'll want to spend at least a couple of focus points in that attribute. Increasing your attributes like one-handed or two-handed weapons will give you faster weapon swings and obviously more damage. All combat attributes are pretty straightforward, which can be said for all of them. Some of these attributes could be better explained. Your companions will also level up, and you can choose to distribute their perk points manually or automatically. I almost forgot to talk about the multiplayer, not because it's bad, I'm just an idiot. You have a couple of different multiplayer gameplay modes, and I think that the fan favorite is probably the Siege. It's quite fun, but it's kinda buggy. My favorite mode is Skirmish, where you just have a couple of flags to defend and smash some heads. I mentioned in my combat guide that people should consider playing this multiplayer mode, even if they're not so interested in multiplayer in general, because if you learn how to block versus a human opponent, NPCs in the single player mode won't give you much trouble. And we have a captain mode, which is a mix of PvP and PvE. Every player gets some troops to command. Overall, you can have a lot of fun in PvP if that's your thing. The last thing I want to talk about is the music and sound effects. The main soundtrack of the game will be stuck in your head for a while. You You can also notice some older tracks from Warband, if you played it of course, but they're entirely redone. The music in the game can create a really nice atmosphere, so Bannerlord didn't disappoint when it comes to this. Sound effects are decent, but they could be a lot better. At least I was hoping they will be much better, but I don't have a lot of problems with this. The combat sounds are satisfying enough, and one of the best effects is definitely the headshot sound. It makes every headshot really enjoyable. And that should cover everything I want to talk about when it comes to this review. I honestly think that I just scratched the surface when it comes to all the features that you'll find in Bannerlord, but this should be enough for creating a clear picture about the game. Bannerlord seems like a proper sequel to Warband, and if you enjoyed playing that game, I think you will love Bannerlord. But if you're a new player and you never came close to this series, just make sure you understand what kind of experience this game has to offer. And I hope this video helped you with that. It's a bit unfriendly to new players, but if you stick with it, you can invest thousands of hours in the game only if you want to. Don't forget to subscribe for more content and click on the bell icon so you don't miss any future uploads. Special thanks to my Patreons, and if you as well want to support this channel in the long run, consider checking out those links in the description. That will be all, and I'll see you in the next one.